All right. Hey, I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor at Town Hall. This is Rational Actors, and today I am here with...
I'm Zack Beauchamp. I am the editor of TP Ideas at Think Progress and a reporter blog right there.
All right, and thanks for being on with me today. We got a couple topics we want to cover, but first off, I know we wanted to touch on the Senator Rand Paul controversy, which has been kind of going around the blogosphere this week. To just make a quick recap of everything that's gone on Tuesday, I believe, the Washington Free Beacon had a report on a Rand Paul aide and co-author on his book. And this guy's name is Jack Hunter. He goes by the moniker and has gone by the moniker the Southern Avenger. He's been a radio host. But in short, he has some kind of a history of saying a little bit politically inappropriate things. He has ties to secessionist and neo-Confederate movements in the South, which, obviously does not play very well politically. And after that, I think a little more troubling than even the initial report, Senator Paul stood by Jack Hunter, saying that he didn't find anything particularly inappropriate in some of Hunter's writings and sayings on the radio, et cetera, et cetera. So just first off, Zach, kind of a thoughts on Senator Paul's inability, I suppose, to distance himself from Hunter initially.
Yeah, I'd say the main reason for that, I think one you've already alluded to, is that they're very, very close. Obviously Hunter was the co-author of his book, and that's how they became close, and he's become a key advisor over the course of Paul's time in the Senate. And when you've worked with someone for quite some time, unless there's a reason that you absolutely have to fire them, and this is what I think is interesting about it, you wouldn't. And what's interesting about that is, well, in most cases you'd think somebody with a history of saying things like, I celebrated John Wilkes Booth, that you might want to fire that person. You might think that you need to in order to preserve the image and the idea that your office is an open, inclusive, tolerant place. But Paul seemed to sort of not grasp that there was a degree of inconsistency between his claim and his defense of Hunter that his office had zero tolerance for, discrimination, intolerance, so to speak, and his claim that Hunter's statements were just youthful indiscretions. It seems to me that a several-year-long career isn't just youthful indiscretions and can't be waved away by function of, well, he was on the radio, he was just doing it as a shtick, and he was in his 20s. I'm in my 20s. I don't celebrate John Wilkes Booth.
Right. I think it might even be kind of worse that, I know Hunter came out and he said, some of the things that I've said are on purposely bombastic to try and gin up controversy, gin up listeners, gin up page views, things like that. And that's not okay, especially for someone who is a politically active figure, obviously influential in helping write, presumably, the authoritative, or at least truthful book of, a major U.S. senator. And I forgot who it was. It might have been Matt Lewis of the Daily Caller, wrote that in some conservative and libertarian circles, the word racist is kind of thrown around, they aren't really concerned with being accused of being racist because they think that it's thrown around kind of nonchalantly these days, and that many charges like that are inappropriate, they won't stick, and kind of it's better to try and ride out the wave. In some cases, I think that's true, and I don't think that Jack Hunter is a racist. I don't think that Rand Paul is a racist. But I certainly think that the race politics tied up in the neo-Confederate movement make it inexpedient for who I used to think actually was an astute politician to keep a man like that around. I used to say that Senator Paul had a lot of the same tendencies as his father, but was a much better pure politician, particularly when it came to marginalized groups like secessionists, neo-Confederates, things like that that are kind of traveling around on the fringes of the conservative and libertarian movements. I don't think I can say that anymore. I think that this indiscretion of hunters is certainly a fireable offense. It's certainly an offense that any smart politician would distance himself from, and Senator Paul hasn't done that. So I'm not sure that Paul is. I'm sure actually that this would not have hurt Paul the way that it will in the future, because he has not immediately distanced himself.
Yeah, I think that the problem here is that Paul is facing a difficulty that is familiar, I think, to a lot of particularly libertarian-ish politicians in American politics, because the libertarian movement itself, while traditionally thought of as one leg of the conservative tripod, in reality, it's more of a business-oriented or sort of deregulatory leg of the Republican Party that makes up the traditional fusionist approach, not pure libertarians, who have always been, for decades since the modern libertarian movement started, largely marginalized in American politics. And as a consequence, there was a divide inside the libertarian movement between, on the one hand, people like Friedrich Hayek, who have been, or were historically, as a major libertarian theorist, and have advocated a very, an almost liberalish libertarianism, that is a libertarianism that's oriented around, well, not liberalish might not be the right word, more like a technocratic libertarianism, one that makes arguments based on detailed and abstract philosophical and economic arguments, and terms its positions based principally on those, as a movement, not just as a political doctrine, as a movement, thinks about those things and uses them as organizing principles. Whereas you had a counter school, essentially, supported by folks like Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell, another wing of the libertarian movement. These guys advocated what I believe it was Rothbard explicitly called reach out to the rednecks. And the strategy, that particular strategy involved, there's a very good article in Reason in 2008 about this, involved defending the Confederacy and reaching out to neo-Confederates, not quite defending it, not saying slavery was good or anything, but saying that, the North was to a certain degree aggressing and states' rights were really important, and making that part and parcel of the libertarian ideal of decentralization and limited government. And as that strategy unfolded, these guys, the people making these arguments, ended up becoming more and more intertwined with the libertarian movement writ large. And the end problem with that, of course, is that you get somebody like Rand Paul, who has a very particular base in the Republican Party, that is, the libertarians, who've managed to, for the first time, get someone who's really of their own milieu into a position of prominence, like, lead senator, very important senator on a lot of issues for the Republican Party. And so Paul is from, a world in which the Hayek and Rothbard libertarianisms are all mixed up. And he depends on these people's support and probably would in a 2016 primary race. So he can't afford to alienate them. But on the other hand, keeping people like Hunter, who is very important to a lot of these people, if you look at reactions from places like the American Conservative, where he's written, I should say I've written too there, but Hunter's written there exceedingly and many, many times. And the editors there have strongly supported him throughout this, saying that the accusations were overblown and so on and so forth. And these are people that are very pro-Paul, oftentimes, or at least very sympathetic to his moves. And so it would alienate his power base, but at the expense of limiting his appeal by not alienating his power base. It's a bit of a dilemma for him.
Right. Now, I kind of want to probe you on you said, I think that your dichotomy in the libertarian movement is largely correct between Hayekians and Rothbardians. I think, and you said that they've become mixed up, they've become intertwined. It's obviously difficult to separate one out from the other. I want to ask, do you really think that Paul's support depends on not alienating the Rothbardians or let's say the Lew Rockwell contingent?
Yeah, that's more accurate.
Yeah, the Lew Rockwell contingent. Because basically the Rockwell contingent has been a non-factor in politics forever. And I'm not sure that Paul needs their support. I think that this is more kind of a race politics blind spot of Senator Paul's more than I need to kind of keep the Rockwell people in my coalition.
So, I think it's important to tease out what we mean by need their support, right? I think that when I said that, I didn't mean that, like, he's dependent on these people for staving off a primary challenge. Like, he could keep his job. The question is, I mean, he obviously, I think, and maybe you disagree with me, but I think he very obviously has presidential ambitions. And I think that any primary fight between him and a number of other fairly prominent conservatives who are positioning themselves for the 2016 nomination will be bitter and will divide different important parts of the conservative coalition. Think, for example, if, as seems at least plausible now, he has to run against Ted Cruz. They split the, like, real, very serious Tea Party contingent, and Paul needs an extra base of support, and one place where he's gotten very loud and very vocal support is from the libertarian movement in general, which has a lot of these people, and it also has a lot of folks who would feel like libertarians were being, a certain frame of libertarian in any event, were being thrown under the bus to please their ideological enemies. I mean, a lot of the libertarian reaction that you read is that this is essentially the neo-Conservatives trying to push them out. And while I think you're right that Lew Rockwell himself hasn't been, and like the people associated with him, haven't been, key determinants of power inside the Republican Party, I can't imagine that a fair number of people who are sympathetic to his views weren't involved in, for example, the Ron Paul presidential runs. That is to say, the massive ground operation that ended up, helping the Ron Paul people in 2008 and especially 2012 take a bunch of primaries and caucuses. I've a lot of the portrayals, it's a lot of young people that are in this movement, and there's some of those, but there's also, if you talk to and read some of the things that Ron Paul supporters write, a lot of people who are at least sympathetic to the positions about decentralization and states' rights that wing of the libertarian movement emphasizes.
I think, that sounds about right. I think actually a good representation of this kind of libertarian movement split is you look at Ron Paul, and you look at Gary Johnson, who, prior to Rand Paul was probably the second most prominent serious libertarian political figure, right? Mm-hmm. And I would say the anti-Rockwell contingent is largely pro-Gary Johnson. A lot of the so-called smart set of libertarians in D.C., people at Reason Magazine, people at the Cato Institute, were very pro-Gary Johnson and far more skeptical of Ron Paul due to a lot of his newsletters controversy, for example, and some of his kind of courting of various fringe conspiracy-ish movements, right? And I think that what libertarians hoped that Rand would do was synthesize those. Well, kind of. Try and synthesize the support from both his father and the type of people who would support Gary Johnson. And I think that this is an episode saying that he is more like his father than he would be like a pragmatic technocrat-type libertarian, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really smart way of thinking about it. I think that the degree to which Rand has been influenced by his father and his father's movement has always been contested by people, and most famously when Rand Paul said that thing about essentially opposing the 1964 Civil Rights Act in that interview with Rachel Maddow. And, that's when a lot of people really were like, well, he's not doing a great job of distancing himself from his father, but that was very early in his career. So people thought that he'd gotten more and more savvy over the course of time, and things like the Stand With Rand, anti-drone stuff, and the filibuster going very mainstream in the Republican Party made it seem like he was doing an excellent job bringing libertarian politics and things that a lot of these... The weird thing, by the way, as an aside, between this Rothbard / Rockwell and Hayek split, is that there's not a whole lot of, if you ignore the almost mood affiliation type, I like the Confederacy, I like abstruse libertarian political theory, there's not a whole lot of policy differences between the two sides in terms of the like main issues in American politics today. They share a lot of similar views about, say, civil liberties, foreign policy, wanting to substantially limit economic authority of the U.S. federal government. In any event, so it seemed like Paul was bringing those views that both sides agreed on into the mainstream effectively in a way that his father never had. And now I think we're seeing, as you've described, him being much closer to his father than you might have previously thought.
Yeah, I think actually the Maddow Civil Rights Act moment was the moment that I think that I said to myself, he's more savvy than his father, because the day after, a lot of people seized on his saying, I'm not sure, I don't exactly remember what it was, but I'm not sure I would have supported the Civil Rights Act, blah, blah, blah. And the day after, he immediately issued a statement saying, well, this is ludicrous. Obviously, the Civil Rights Act has done great things in society. And that was kind of instantly distancing himself from what you might term a political slip-up, right? And that wasn't the case that happened here. Now, I think part of the problem that that Paul has had, well, both Pauls now have had with kind of courting the neo-Confederates, the types of secessionists, are the race politics involved, and that they don't really understand the gravity of them, right? And I don't actually think that Jack Hunter or the neo-Confederate movement are about race politics. The people involved are genuinely, want to keep race politics out of the discussion. And I think that the problem is that they don't see kind of the primacy of race politics being inextricably wrapped up in secessionist movements and the neo-Confederate movement and things like that. And Jason Kuznicki at the Cato Institute actually had a really good article on this a couple days ago, kind of quoting from the Confederate Constitution, pointing out that, while there's the neo-Confederate movement wants to kind of wipe away the slavery in the battle between South and North in the Civil War, that the Confederate Constitution really put it as its kind of raison d'etre, saying that, slavery and, obviously government legal recognition of the ownership of human beings is, an absolutely necessary thing for the Confederacy to exist. And so I think these neo-Confederates and kind of secessionists today largely ignore that, which obviously is a huge problem in modern politics, but it's less of kind of overt racism and more of a racist blind spot, right, for the neo-Confederates and the Pauls, obviously, and the politicians that court movements like this.
Yeah, I think I would be careful in saying that it's not on the whole about race. Now, that I would caution that I don't think it's right to describe Hunter or the Pauls as racists. I'm not sure how much it matters to parse what the word racist means, but if you read Hunter's essays on race, some of his recent ones anyway, they're certainly not, they're actually fairly friendly towards, causes. I can't believe I have to say this in 2013, but they're fairly friendly towards the idea of equality between people of different skin tones. But so setting aside the
shocking, right?
Yeah, right. That like this is the thing that we need to be talking about. Setting aside that sort of semi-absurdity, I think a lot of the what we've been calling neo-Confederacy or like sort of neo-Confederate sympathies can be divided again almost into two camps. There's the Rothbard people or Rothbard in particular. Personally, if you, again, reading his work, you don't get the sense that he's motivated by racial animus at all. He just saw an opportunity to build a coalition. But a lot of these other people, I mean, it's given that in modern society, we don't look kindly, or at least mainstream political society doesn't look kindly on people saying overtly and clearly, pro-slavery, pro-segregation things. These are actually affirming those things as good policies, the fastest way to irrelevancy, or one of the fastest ways to irrelevancy in modern politics. People develop ways to talk about race and to say we identify with white nationalism without saying, we're white nationalists and putting on a white hood. And one of the ways historically that people have done that in the past several decades is by expressing sympathy to the Confederacy. The Confederate flag is not, and we can probably agree, it's not a race-neutral symbol. It's a symbol of racial superiority, of a society that was organized in the way that Jason, that really excellent piece, described as being fundamentally about the ownership of human beings by virtue of their skin tone. That's what the Confederacy was. And so I don't think, while many people managed to convince themselves that, it was about states' rights and the North was attempting to restrict the liberty of the South, some people probably do, I think, genuinely believe that it was about that, not slavery. I'm sure they do, though it's wrong. I think many people full well understand the Civil War was fought over slavery. And making, sort of neo-Confederacy integral to their political identity is about saying, we think there was something important about a system of racial superiority, and we're not going to outright say it, but this is what we mean.
Right. I'm not a mind reader en masse,
That's
so
true.
I can't verify the truth or non-truth of that, but I do think to a certain extent that people who have convinced themselves of, the Confederate flag not being a symbol of race politics and actually being about, states' rights, anti-economic power from the central government, I think they're largely genuine in their beliefs, even if, self-decepting. Yes, there are certainly people who are cognizant of the racial coding and exploit that. Like you said, people who want to build coalitions that have racists in them without being racist, right? I'm not sure that being unaware of the privilege that comes from being white and kind of deceiving oneself about the economic history of the United States is disqualifying, right, for public office or for being an aide or whatever. Because if not being fully aware of the privilege that comes with being white is disqualifying, then there would be no employees on Capitol Hill.
You're referencing the Chris Hayes thing, I assume.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't see.
Oh, Chris Hayes on his show, when the Hunter stuff broke, went on and said, essentially, I think this is a direct quote, Rand Paul, that's 3 racist strikes and you're out, and argued that this particular set of views being in his office was disqualifying for holding public policy, or holding at least any high office.
Right. I think that not distancing himself from Hunter was a really, really bad mistake, especially given Rand Paul's history of not being all that sensitive on race politics issues. I think that if he had distanced himself from Hunter immediately and said, I don't know, is a good writer. Obviously, he writes at the American Conservative. He's respected by conservatives in the movement generally. But a lot of this is troubling, so I'm going to not associate myself with him anymore. Would have been a much better path for him to take, right?
Yeah, I think that that's true both politically and normatively, right? Like, I don't know Jack Hunter. I haven't talked to him ever. And so I have no way of assessing. In the way that you said earlier, I'm not a mind reader, right? It's important to try to be charitable to people with whom you have profound disagreements. And so, like, I can't say, what he actually feels about some of these things. I can only make judgments based on what he said publicly. And what he said publicly are, I think to a certain extent, this is what was important to what Chris said, is that these are sentiments that have such power and resonance in the American political story that have played such important roles in justifying terrible, terrible policies, and have done so persuasively to many people, and whose legacies still have not been fully eliminated by any stretch of the imagination, that they really are things that need to be held to a higher standard than a lot of other things that might qualify as political scandals. I think something like this, for example, is much more disqualifying than a personal sin like infidelity, because it has real political salience. It's essentially mainstreaming views that shouldn't be mainstreamed, because when they have been, the results have been catastrophic. And so I think that it's a huge mistake on Rand Paul's part, and you can say that without having to say that Jack Hunter is a terrible person who should never work again and should be consigned to the dustbin of history or whatever. You can just say that by virtue of what he chose to do in the past, he has made a decision to take himself out of this, like, being involved intimately in the structures of governance. I have no problem with him, writing essays all the time or anything like that. It's just government is uniquely important in the story and the way that we talk about race and think about it.
I would certainly agree. The importance, I think, of public shaming neo-Confederates for not recognizing the sheer monstrosity that was the Confederacy is important, and important in kind of public discourse, right?
Yeah, I think that's, public shaming is kind of an uncomfortable phrase to use, but it's, in this case, probably not wrong.
Right, well, public shaming, using the power of culture to, try and change norms, if you don't want to say shaming. I just use that as shorthand, but yes.
Yeah.
I think that I want to move on now to what happened yesterday on Capitol Hill, which was House Republicans voted to split and pass a farm bill, which really upset me. I'm not great at conveying anger through writing, but I had a piece on Town Hall yesterday about it. Basically, House Republicans took the advice of a lot of conservative activists and even think tanks and things like that, and split the farm bill into two separate bills, one that deals with the agriculture policy of the farm bill and one that deals with the supplemental nutrition assistance program, or commonly known as food stamps. And while conservatives have long advocated splitting the farm bill like this, House Republicans went about it in the exact wrong manner. They split it and then passed the farm policy part, which is the part most ripe for reform, largely unreformed, and in fact, as I wrote yesterday, even worse than if they had just passed the farm bill. The farm policy that the House Republicans passed yesterday spends more than kind of the straight-up reauthorization that Senate Democrats passed last month, and in addition to that, makes a lot of the farm policy permanent rather than having a 5-year sunset, which typically is how the farm bill works. And more than that, because they split those apart and now they have to deal with SNAP separately, I fear that House Republicans are going to go after SNAP incredibly aggressively, when in reality, food stamps are not the worst welfare program from a conservative perspective. They're certainly ripe for reform in some ways, but giving people money for food is largely one of the better welfare programs that you can have. And I think that House Republicans made a huge mistake, and President Obama already said he was going to veto the split farm bill, which would be fine with me. But I know that conservative activists were really upset yesterday because the farm policy, the subsidies, the price supports, the direct payments all pass unreformed. And Democrats, it was interesting to me to be watching House Democrats giving really impassioned speeches yesterday, being right but for all the wrong ways, in my opinion, because obviously they want both farm policy and food stamps to be attached, because that makes it more politically difficult for Republicans to go after one or the other. What's your take on that?
So, I suspect that, well, I don't know if we'll agree in every detail, but largely, to me the biggest question is obviously the amount of assistance that you get from the Farm Bill, right? SNAP is one of the most effective and least fraudulent anti-poverty programs we have in the United States, right? Like, the fraud rate is less than 1%. It halved the poverty rate in certain sectors in 2011. it kept something like 5 million kids off of out of poverty in 2010, right? Like the numbers, and they're roughly, those are approximations. I don't remember the exact figure, but like those are extraordinary numbers, and that a program that doesn't spend all that much money is fairly responsive to recession spending, because there's an income level cutoff. If people lose a bunch of money, then they're able to go on SNAP. So it helps people when they're in the worst situations, like directly after the Great Recession, and then spending levels subside naturally when people get wealthier. It strikes me as one of the most integral elements of any advanced democracy that you provide people with food. That is to say, the essential thing that they need, one of the essential things they need, like water and clothes, in order to participate as full members of society. And like any idea that we should cut that kind of support substantially strikes me as, to a certain degree, an attack on the idea of a sort of shared state in which the government's role is to give people the bare minimum necessary to participate in public life as like free people. And that's harsh language, but I like, this is life or death for a lot of people who don't have very much money, or at least it could come very close to something like that. It's deadly serious for them. And so that's the part of this that matters the most to me. Tangentially, I also think that things like the sugar subsidy, which are extended, and I think you were referencing earlier, the sugar subsidy is a terrible idea. It props up an industry domestically that only survives to a certain degree by virtue, or like has the hegemony that it has now anyway, by virtue of extensive government support when prices could be much lower for consumers across the board. And I don't see any reason to subsidize large American sugar companies specifically. I don't see any evidence, for example, that it's really critical to sustaining job growth inside the United States. Instead, it's just a handout to industry. So it just like splitting the farm bill such that we can increase and cement privileges for large corporations while at the same time slashing critical food assistance for people that need it strikes me as the worst of all possible worlds.
Right. So I'm going to defend Republicans here. I don't think that, and I doubt that Republicans are going to slash food stamps to an unsustainably low level. I think that they like it as a political tool. I think that Republicans have had this narrative in the past few years that Obama is the food stamp president, because under his administration, food stamps, both spending and number of households on food stamps has risen enormously, and so they claim that this is a symbol of Obama handing out cash to people who don't deserve it or whatever, which I think is incredibly ignorant and really wrong. Because obviously it doesn't take into account that we had an enormous recession that was not Obama's fault. You could say that, and I think that to a certain extent, you could say that the slow recovery might have been the result of suboptimal policies put into place. But for the most part, I think this is a pretty bad talking point for Republicans. But I also doubt that any changes that will be made to the food stamp program will have a huge effect. I am, like a lot of the conservative activists, in favor of splitting the farm bill so I think that maybe your worry about the food stamp program is a little unfounded. The reason that a lot of conservative activists wanted to split the farm bill in the first place is because food stamps are so politically important that typically Republicans are going to be unable to go after food stamps, right? It's an incredibly powerful talking point for Democrats that Republicans are slashing a very effective and necessary program. Conservative activists wanted to split the farm bill so that they could go after the industrial policy, because it's hard to vote against a $1 or $1 trillion farm bill that is mostly food stamps, because there's, $15 billion of waste in the sugar subsidy program, So I stand with a lot of those conservative activists in being furious that they managed to split the farm bill but didn't go after what was important to go after once it was split.
Well, I mean, that's, I think, evidence for my thesis as to what's going on here, and the view that's common among, at least, left and Democratic circles, is generally that the reason to keep the farm bill together is that otherwise Republicans would attempt to do things like there were several amendments attached by various different Republican congressmen over the course of the Farm Bill drafting session this time around that included things like a work requirement that was unfunded, which has never happened in SNAP before. And a lot of the times people are getting SNAP assistance because they lost their job. And the work requirement was unfunded and there was no money for job training. So essentially what you're saying is we're not going to help you try to find a job, but if you can't find one on your own in the midst of a recession, well, then we're also going to take away your food, or at least a main source of your food. And they've also proposed some relatively significant cuts that would take several million people off the rolls. These ones are more mainstream in the party than some of the other ones. And so the view from the left has always been, I mean, we have to keep them together as much as we don't like the rest of the Farm Bill, which is, I think, basically everybody, virtually everyone who isn't part of a major farm corporation thinks is terrible. On the whole, it's just like an awful bill. But
part of a major farm corporation, or you come from a state or district that has major farm corporations that, are giving you money, are lobbying you to keep the farm bill intact, or to keep the sugar subsidies or the price supports, the direct payments, or things like that, right?
Right. Yeah. This is like a classic case of there being a general public interest in not passing anything like this bill, and there being very, very specific interests who want it to get passed, and who, because they're small and concentrated, have much closer access to legislators. Whereas, who's going to lobby on behalf of the general welfare of the public, in this particular case, to try to get rid of the terrible industrial policies that you and I have both been criticizing. And so that's part of the problem here, right, is that while a lot of conservative activists, in the way that you're describing it, might think that we should substantially reform the handouts to large corporations that are in the main Farm Bill, the not SNAP part, it doesn't seem like they're serving as an effective lobbying counterweight to the very, very discrete, specific, well-funded, either farm lobbies or like Congress people who come from farm districts who are willing to push around or really heavily advocate for these strong policies, especially inside the Republican Party too.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that it was really frustrating to see John Boehner bring that legislation to the floor yesterday. I mean, every conservative organization lined up against it. Freedom Works issued a key vote against the Farm Bill, which put them in the unique position of saying, I don't remember how many, 190 Democrats, 200 Democrats got a thumbs up from Freedom Works, and 217 Republicans got a thumbs down.
First time ever.
I know, right? So, and we think of, we think of conservative organizations like that as being really effective in D.C., and that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think that this is a really good example of the inability of a lot of conservative activists, conservative movement organizations to affect legislation against, I don't know if I would say that farm corporations have the largest hand. I think that status quo bias is larger than anything on Capitol Hill today. So it's a lot easier for conservatives or Republicans to say, hey, we split the Farm Bill, but we're passing both of these things, with no changes at all, which I'm not sure that they will with SNAP, but they can say, look, we split the Farm Bill, but we're really nice people, so we're not going to change anything in them, which to me and to other conservatives is really the wrong attitude to take. It wasn't that I wanted them to split the Farm Bill in and of itself. That wasn't an end. That was just a means to an end of reforming the industrial policy. And the inability of Republican legislators to recognize that is really shocking.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting elements here is that one of the I think more promising trends in grassroots conservative thinking recently has been the rise of what a few people have called libertarian populism, which is basically an argument that the nexus between government and business is one of the critical problems facing the American economy and needs to be in a variety of different ways cut. And this is something that even people, from my point of view, should cheer, right? There are a lot of really bad connections between government and business, perhaps most egregiously in the banking sector, but also in the farm sector. That's what the Farm Bill is. It's I mean, it's what Sarah Palin would call crony capitalism, though I don't know. She might like the Farm Bill. But it's certainly that type of phrasing. Is just...
I'm not sure how much of the Farm Bill goes to Alaska, but probably a significant amount.
Yeah, I have no idea. I just, knowing Sarah Palin. So, I think that is a very promising strand of conservative thinking in terms of developing like new and effective ways of reconceptualizing Republican public policy positions. But like, if that were really taking hold inside the party, then what you described, the outcome that you wanted, would have been the one that the party pushed. But instead, it pushed this worst of both worlds. We're going to separate SNAP from the Farm Bill, making it vulnerable to the people in the Republican Party that do want to cut it pretty substantially, while at the same time making the main Farm Bill worse. That is to say, more egregiously pro-large business. And so, I'm curious to hear what your take on what that says about the future of the party in this respect is.
Right. So it makes the Republican Party, which I am generally aligned with, a lot harder to defend, right? From, like you said, attacks that they're pro-business and anti-poor people. The libertarian, I think that libertarian populism taking hold in the Republican Party would be generally a good thing. And a lot of the politicians that have kind of gotten a lot of media hype recently, you could term as being in that general vein. Senator Rand Paul, Congressman Justin Amash, who reportedly had a very heated confrontation with Boehner yesterday. Even, Senator Mike Lee, Ted Cruz even has some tendencies that way, right? But what happened yesterday was really, this is in the House, not the Senate, but it was really troubling to see Republicans just not get it. And one of the big worries of people who would like to see a more libertarian populist Republican Party is that the Republican Party is uniquely libertarian right now because they don't control the executive branch. And that once they control the executive branch, that's going to be out the window, and it's going to be it'll be George W. Bush all over again, right? With a guy who's in there who's kind of hostile to government skepticism, who is far more of a pragmatist than someone who would generally kind of doubt that government mandates and centralized reform are the way to go. So I think that it's certainly a data point pointing to the idea that libertarian populism is just a flash in the pan, brought about by the unique circumstances of Barack Obama being in the executive branch, and that whoever it may be that wins the Republican nomination in 2016 should be looked at really skeptically if they were to get into the White House.
So does this, this assessment of the situation make you concerned about the direction that the party's heading politically in the future? Do you think, generally, do you think that the slate of public policies it has right now are sort of all right? Or do you, did you really, you have obvious frustration with the way that the Farm Bill turned out. Right. Do you think that real change is needed in these areas?
So to a certain extent, I don't expect a whole lot of political parties. Like I said,
Fair.
I think that status quo bias is the most powerful force in politics, and that reform is incredibly difficult to achieve even for the most ardent reform. Let's say the most kind of true believer in libertarian populism got into the White House somehow. I think it would still be incredibly difficult for him to change anything substantially. Because a lot of American government is set up so that you can't have radical change in short periods of time. So you need kind of a far larger and more sustained movement over a period of many, many years. I don't know that... So I thought that the Tea Party movement in 2010 was largely a good thing for the party. But I'm not quite sure that is going to continue to be the case in the future.
Yeah, I for fairly obvious ideological reasons, was always a Tea Party skeptic. Right. Sort of always thought that it was just an extension of the party's core principles. That is to say, it's what people believe right now. It's just a particular expression of, of the Republican base. So it wasn't anything unique and libertarian-y in a way that would be a substantial improvement over the course of the current direction of the party. And it just is a sort of more ideologically pure version of current republicanism. And I think that things like the Farm Bill vote suggest that that prediction's largely been borne out, with a few exceptions, like you said. Sometimes folk like Rand Paul, who will get lumped in with Tea Party people. I'm not sure how accurate that is as a matter of, who actually supported him. Ted Cruz, probably more accurately. And I don't know about Justin Amash, whether it was a bunch of Tea Party activists that helped him win the primary and ultimately the general.
He's a more interesting case.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's a much more interesting case. Because he seems to be very, very consistent in a way that even Rand Paul isn't.
Yes. He seems consistent to a fault like Ron Paul was.
Yeah.
No, I think that probably, and I can't say this for sure, but the predictions that the Tea Party was more of a extension of the Republican base than kind of a populist movement have largely been borne out, which I think is unfortunate. I would like to tell myself that the initial kind of Tea Party outbursts were more populist than what happened later, and that later both business interests and the Republican Party in general was able to subsume the Tea Party sentiment into the larger Republican Party. But I can't say for sure. I would like to see, like you said, I'd like to see a more libertarian-ish Republican Party. Well, smart, pragmatic, libertarian-ish Republican Party that knows its limits, that isn't purely libertarian, that is generally anti some of the more hardcore libertarian policies, but still kind of recognizes that skepticism of government power is the motivating force behind the party would be nice to see, but I don't think that has been borne out in recent years. So we'll have to see where that goes in the future.
Yeah, I also think there's another interesting related thing about the sort of future of the party in this Farm Bill vote, which is that it's obvious that Senate Democrats, who obviously control the Senate, will never accept this version of the split bill. And so some kind of compromise is going to have to be reached, and that's another thing that especially House Republicans have not been great at recently, is developing compromises with Democrats in the other chamber or in their own chamber. And that's part and parcel, I think, of a general trend in the party towards not having very much interest in sort of compromise legislation, the give and take of what had, over the course of the post-war American Republic been the standard legislative practice of we get a little bit, you get a little bit. And the party that controls a particular legislator gets most of it because they control that branch of the legislature, and then they flip it around when the other party wins the next election, and so on and so forth. And so passing this kind of farm bill, to me, seems like a clear statement that we're going to continue down the same path of doing essentially whatever it is that we want, and then putting the ball in the Democrats' court and being all right, your turn, try to figure out some solution. We're just going to try to do exactly and pass exactly the kind of bill that we wish we would pass. Right.
I would say that if you were to look at the Farm Bill vote as just a giant symbol, they've voted to repeal Obamacare 42 times, and everyone knows that goes nowhere. So if you look at it as the House Republicans just saying, here we made this vote, America, look at us, we made this vote, and then in conference it gets changed, and we largely get a status quo farm bill and a status quo food stamps bill, that's kind of more of a representation of, I suppose, how the House is being run under John Boehner, though I actually do have a lot of respect for John Boehner. I found that New Republic, he has a really hard job. His caucus is incredibly, because of the 2010 elections, his caucus is incredibly diverse and incredibly hostile to kind of playing the partisan game. And if you want to term the partisan game as compromise, right? They say, and a lot of the kind of people swept into power in 2010 were people who didn't come from political life, small businessmen and local activists and things like that, who, for them, compromise isn't the name of the game. For them, they said, we are not politicians. We think that compromise is the essence of, why Washington is ruined right now. So we're not going to do that. And John Boehner, obviously, I think is a far more pragmatic figure than that. And he has to control those elements in his party while also maintaining his speakership. And I actually think that the fiscal cliff compromise is a really good example of House Republicans being able to recognize when a situation calls for kind of putting down grandstanding and getting something done, right? In that, while the Senate obviously took the lead in it, John Boehner brought this legislation to the floor that his caucus hated and passed it with majority Democrat support rather than majority Republican support. So I think that House Republicans and House Republican leadership can be pragmatic and kind of compromising when they want to be or when they need to be. But if you want to look at the Farm Bill as largely symbolic of the anti-Washington attitude of a lot of the House Republican caucus, then that would be better, I think, for the long-term outlook of the Republican Party.
Sorry, when you say that would, you mean
if the Republican caucus and Republican House leadership knew that the Farm Bill is just a symbol that that everyone knows is going to get changed in conference, that Obama certainly isn't going to sign in its current form, then that's a better outcome and a better motivating force actually for the Republican Party than if they actually believed in what they passed yesterday.
Yeah, that would certainly be true. And I just, it's hard. It's hard to tell right now, but it seems like there's been. I mean, we had a huge debate over the Farm Bill last year too, in roughly the same fashion, where especially sort of the grassroots House Republicans or slightly out of the leadership ones really pushed for significant cuts to SNAP without challenging the subsidy bits. So I think this might be an enduring expression of their views, but you're right. It's a question of whether Boehner is just like, well, we'll let them have this one and then we'll corral it in conference, which very well might be what he's doing. But on the other hand, the still ongoing sequestration process suggests that that's not always the way that things work out. That sometimes, it ends up enacting a policy that nobody thinks is a good idea. And
I don't want to get into the policy merits of sequestration right now. But
fair enough. This is roughly the end of the conversation. But, all right, let me put it this way. Things that at least some things in there that nobody thinks are good ideas.
Right. Yes. And yeah, it's just so, well, just to end on this, it's so frustrating that one of the largest parts of wasteful government spending that is agreed upon by left and right was passed by the House yesterday unreformed, when they had a golden opportunity to actually change something about it. So hopefully it gets fixed in conference, or even, passing another 5-year farm bill that every single policy has to come up for reauthorization in 5 years would be much better than what happened yesterday. But I suppose we'll see. Do you have anything else to add before we sign off here?
Yeah, I think that it's very frustrating that a bill that people with views as divergent as you and I can agree is fundamentally terrible is not being challenged in the way that it should be and not being cut in the right places. And it, I think, has a lot of lessons that we've been talking about for a while for broader American politics.
All right, well, I think we've exhausted those topics for today. We didn't get to Mark Leibovich's book, but maybe that's something for next time. Thanks a lot, Zach, for taking some time to talk with me today.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
And we'll see everyone next time.